It is my pleasure to say that we're here today to learn from Anna Farrow Henderson, author of this book, Core Samples. Anna is a PhD scientist, geologist. She has worked in environmental policy as an environmental policy advisor to Senator Al Franken and Governor Mark Dayton. And she is an instructor at the Loft Literary Center. And so please join me in welcoming Anna Farrow Henderson.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. Is this mic working?
That is a mic for the Zoom crowd.
Oh.
Want to hold this mic, or do you want to use that one?
Oh, I can use this one. Cool. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here, and it's a privilege to share my book with all of you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book. I'm going to read from the book, and you are all welcome to purchase copies of the book. They're being sold outside by Paragus Northwoods Company. And then this afternoon, I have these two other events. And if you're curious about those or, what's happening, they're all going to be kind of different from each other. The zine making will be very much like a hands-on craft making. You don't need any prior experience in anything to come do that. Lots of people have a book in them. Lots of people have many books in them. And the publishing world is so weird. And making zines is something accessible to everybody to make a book and distribute a book. So that's why it's really special to me to share, because we can all be part of it. And at Climate Group, I will be talking about the book, but I'm going to talk about different things. And I have a different creative activity I'm really excited to try out doing with folks there. So, so I'll talk and read a little bit, and there'll be plenty of time for questions, and then I'll sign books if anyone's interested. So I'll be getting to this, but just the last time I was in this room here at the Grand Ely Lodge was for the Water Town Hall with Governor Mark Dayton in 2017, I think. And we got a really nice welcome with, Dayton's name on the marquee, and some coverage. Is anybody here? Were you in the room? Yeah, so there's at least one person who's in the room. We had really long tables, such a long room, and a lot of discussion. And it was we were traveling around the state doing a lot of these big public meetings, and we had all kinds of protesters on all kinds of topics at each of the meetings. And when we came to this meeting and I was getting set up, a group came and they had like matching shirts. They were drinking out in the other room. So they were really like pre-partying, getting ready. And they said very politely, like, hi, like I want to introduce myself and just letting you know we plan to make a disturbance and like disrupt your meeting. And I was like, okay, thanks for letting me know. Which like not all protesters introduce themselves, but actually often they do. And if you're going to be protesting a politician who has security, it's actually really practical. Just as a note. Yeah, we had like a water summit, and people came and they're like, we're going to protest, and they introduced themselves. And we talked to security. Security was like, could you come from stage left and not stage right? And they were like, okay, all right. So then it's like, it's all happening, and then they protest, and it was like, would you like to stay for lunch? And then they stayed for lunch. So you can protest and introduce yourself and like have some choreography so that everything goes smoothly. But I really appreciated the community in Ely for this meeting, and those folks who were going to protest, they actually just joined the meeting, and nothing ever happened. So I think that meant that the meeting was a success, or they had just already had so much beer. This was the only place where we had beer available to order at one of those public meetings, so, which kind of changes things a little bit. So I am on a book tour. Core Samples came out October 22nd, I think, 22nd, 23rd. And since then, I've been doing a number of events. I did about 20 events in 2024. I went to college and university classrooms and lecture halls and bookstores and libraries. I really like libraries. I like doing events at libraries. I had an event at a spice shop. And I went to a number of different places around the country. But I also have a Minnesota State Art Board grant to support me going to rural communities in Minnesota with the goal of bringing art access to folks in rural communities. And so that's supporting me here today That's the Minnesota Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment that was supported by the voters of Minnesota to create that funding for art and parks and trails and clean water. So on the book. So core samples, the title refers to the literal samples that I studied as a scientist. I spent about a decade as a research scientist. I was primarily field-based, but being field-based also means you actually spend a lot of time in labs. But I identified with the field-based part more than the lab-based part. And the types of samples I was studying were lake sediment cores. This is a core from Steele Lake, which is near the headwaters of the Mississippi, near Itasca State Park. Cores from trees, so tree ring samples. I used data from ice cores. I did work on glaciers for part of the time. And everywhere I went collecting these samples and studying these samples in the field and the lab, I was taking notes on everything because you just never know what information is going to be important later. You want to have redundancy. You might have a machine taking your GPS points, write it all down also because it's really precious that you've spent that time and gotten to these places. A lot of the places I went were remote and took quite a lot of effort to get in. I once had to design a boat that I could hike up above tree line, which took about, it's like a 7-hour hike, and then have 2 people standing on to retrieve sediment cores and then hike back down. So it was hard to get to these places. We wanted to make sure we had all the information. So this is a picture of all my notebooks. And when I was taking all these scientific notes and really focused on that, I also would have these lines of poetry or other thoughts or just the urge to sketch in words what I was doing, because it was often weird, like carrying a boat that I've made for 7 hours to a site above the tree line. And so this picture on the far side is showing some of that just kind of like creative scribbling. I would work from the back to the front of the notebooks with that. And this is a picture of pollen. Has anybody here looked at pollen under a microscope? Cool. Yeah, pollen has beautiful forms. There are other things that you find in lake sediments also, like diatoms, that are just absolutely gorgeous. And that is some of what I was looking at in these sediments with the goal of reconstructing landscape history and climate history over the last like 10 to 12,000 years. I did work on soils that were more like 1 million years old. The title Core Samples also has a literary double meaning, which is referring to the intimate and personal nature of the writing. So this is not a book that is about science. It's not explaining science. It's not arguing politics. It's a book about being a human working in these spaces and what that is like and what is the humanity of these places. So just to tell you a little bit about myself and how I became a scientist, how I started writing in notebooks so much. So that's my first diary. And I kept it. My family spent 2 years living abroad when I was a little kid. This is me and my brother outside Dharamsala, India. And we had traveled by land, by car and bus and train, and sometimes horseback through the Tibetan Plateau for about 9 months. And then we lived in Dharamsala for about 9 months, and I went to kindergarten there. And there were a few key things that happened during that time that really shaped my perspective. So the first one is that mostly we didn't have running treated drinking water or electricity. And so I realized and understood that those are not a given, but they're something that you build and that take quite a bit of effort to have. There was a really big earthquake when I was in India, and there was evidence of past earthquakes. So just this understanding of geologic processes was firsthand. Was something that was interesting and weird to see. I didn't really know what to think of it, but it left an impression. And I saw what it meant to live on the land and live with the seasons. When we were traveling through the Tibetan Plateau, most of the people we were spending time with were nomads who were herding yak and goat, and their primary food was the animals they were herding. So this is my equation. My editor with the book, he was like, how did you become a scientist? Like, this was this really like, you have to write about this. And he was like looking for a story, like, did you love dinosaurs? And I was like, no, I didn't love, I mean, I love dinosaurs, but I didn't like love dinosaurs. So this was like the equation that I came up with, which was then like how I wrote the first chapter of the book, which is not written in this format at all, but this for me was like how I wrote the first chapter, which is becoming a scientist is this need for wonder, a framework for life, and vigilance and observation. And these are just photos from different places that I have done field work. And I guess the thing about this like pressure to be like, how did you become a scientist? It's like, well, what is a scientist? And like, what does it mean that I'm a scientist? I kind of have the same feeling about like, what does it mean that I'm a writer? And that in reality, like all it is to be an artist is that you are interested in creating things and you play with things. And all it is to be a scientist is that you ask questions and you're curious. And probably like most people in this room are both of those things too. So the first time I did like a long expedition of field work was on the Juneau ice field. I spent 2 months collecting samples and working with a team. This is a picture from the ice field up here. And what was so totally shocking to me was how messy it was. Like, I mean, you have a bunch of people in isolation for 8 weeks on a glacier, and you have all their personalities. And even the way you're doing the science would be like, why are we doing it this way? And it's like, well, because this person is in charge of that and that's what they want to do. And just the realization of how human messy it was, and that it wasn't like in the textbooks where things are clear and they're sterile and they're clean and they're crisp and there's an equation, but it's like this mess, was actually really compelling to me, and much more interesting than what I had thought science was from like a textbook. So when I was defending my PhD, I had my first child 4 months before I defended my PhD, which was fine. I'm an organized person. I can build a boat to hike up to, you know, the top of a mountain. But it really changed how people saw me, and I could perceive that and see this difference of like that. Now that I was a mom, people were like, well, what are you doing here? And that was an interesting experience to go through. But the thing that really changed the most when I became a mom was my relationship to time. So time with a baby changes, like they change day to day and week to week. One day they can't smile and then they're laughing, or, you know, they can't walk and then they're running. And I had been studying climate change over thousands and millions of years, but climate was happening right now. And we really didn't have any kind of connection between the work we were doing and what was going on with conversations about climate in Minnesota or at the national level. And I felt an urgency to participate. So I left my research and I went to work for Al Franken in the US Senate. And at that time, I was actually pregnant with my second child. So he hired me when I was 6 months pregnant. And that was a really good experience. And I thought I might read a section of the book about that. So this is from the Congressional Lactation Diary. And, and I'm guessing that, you know, someone else in here has also had to pump milk in an office before. If you ever need to or know someone who needs to, the US Senate is a great place. They have lactation rooms that are available to the general public. You don't have to do anything beforehand. You can just walk in and ask to use one. And I kept a diary while I was in there because, I mean, you're just sitting still and it seemed like a nice thing to do. It was kind of my only alone time. And this is a picture of that diary that I kept while pumping milk. So April 1st, 2013. I'm on the verge of tears and half naked in the United States Senate. My pump won't work. I don't know what to do. The lactation room has a chair, a fridge, a sink, beige walls, and a door that locks. I checked in with a nurse at the front desk, but I can't ask for help with this. I hear metal curtain rings slide in the room next door where sick people are lying down. I don't know if I can do this job and be a mother, never mind keep up milk production, but I can write everything down. This will be my lactation diary. Whew, okay, I just took the pump completely apart, put it back together, and bingo. It's a trick I learned with mass spectrometers in the laboratory. Sometimes, if you can't figure out what went wrong or why, just start fresh. When I walked into the building this morning, electricity went up my legs. Each click click of my heel sent a shock. The black veins and flecks in the marble walls don't match from one block to another, creating a sense of motion. It's like birds flying in the distance or wind rustling in the leaves. It's like the building is alive. As a climate scientist, I was trying to make a difference, but shouting in a room with other scientists wasn't getting anywhere. No one else was listening. I didn't know how to be heard or who to talk to. But here I am in the middle of it all. Ooh. A friend from my lab said that my postdoctoral advisor told them I'd gone off the deep end. She was as likely referring to me having a second child as to my work in Congress. When she congratulated me on my fellowship, she said that if I left, I could never come back. But does that mean I'm no longer a scientist? Ounces pumped, 9. I kept track. That's part of pumping milk, is you keep track of how much milk you're pumping. As the essay goes on, I start keeping track also of push-ups, which starts with a half, just like not able to do any push-ups. And I worked up to doing 60 push-ups every time I pumped, which is like, I think kind of amazing. So if you're ever thinking like, man, I can't do push-ups, I'm here to tell you, you can start from nothing and get really, really far. So when I started working in Al Franken's office, I was 6 months pregnant, and at 9 months pregnant, I had my first piece of literary writing accepted into a literary journal, which was awesome, except I was like about to go into labor and I was working for a politician and I could not figure out the Senate ethics handbook about publishing literary nonfiction. It was like, it would have been cool if it was fiction and if it was like an op-ed or something, there was a process to go through, but it was an essay that a later version is in this book about working on the ice field, which didn't really feel like I should go through some process with a bunch of people I met 3 months ago when I was about to go into labor. So I used a pen name, which is E.A. Faro. And when this book was accepted for publication, they said that that was contingent on using my name and not pen name. And so the kind of deal we struck was that I just put Faro into my name and just make that my name. So, and yeah, so these are some of the other things that I was writing. I was teaching at the Loft under the pen name. It's kind of fun if you have a pen name, like you go to a conference, you just go under the pen name. But every once in a while I get a piece of mail from somebody in earnest who doesn't know me as anything other than E.A. Faro. And then I feel sort of awkward. And just with this pen name, you know, it's something that people like have questions about or kind of like ideas of like, what does it mean to have a pen name? And, you know, it wasn't like an alternate or different version of myself. It was very much me, but it was me setting up a place to write on the back steps of the duplex that we lived in, or it was me composing poetry while I'm pipetting chemicals in a fume hood or pumping milk in the US Senate. So it wasn't a different version of me. It was just a really isolated version. And that my writing was so isolated says something about the cultures of science and politics, which I think is sort of kind of the goal of what I'm trying to get at with writing the book. Both academics and politics are mission driven. They're about something bigger than ourselves. They're about being in a team. And there's nothing more thrilling than being on a field expedition or working for a political office, as have other people here. I'm sure people here have been on expeditions. Have people here been on science expeditions? Do we have at least one or two? Has anybody here worked for a political office? Got one, two. Yeah, so I don't know. Actually, I said this at an event in Ohio. I was like, it's so exciting to be on a field expedition. And this guy in the front was like, I hate it. So just, you know, but I thought it was very exciting. But when you're doing something like that, when you're really part of a team that has so much urgency and time sensitivity, you sacrifice a lot of things, you know, your sleep, your weekends, vacation, comfort, sometimes your physical safety. And what gets presented to the public is really calculated It's scrubbed of the dirt and the late night dance parties in the governor's office or the loud music in the laboratory. And what that means is the public really misses out on seeing that drama and on some good stories. And it can be really hard for people to relate to or empathize with or even trust science or politics. And my hope is that sharing these human stories of these places makes science and politics feel more accessible and also feel like it belongs to you because it belongs to you. I was gonna read something about being a scientist and I just totally forgot, but I kind of want to go back to it. That seems kind of fun. So this is an essay that's called Dear Spartina. Does anybody know what Spartina is? It's a tidal marsh grass, so it doesn't grow here. And it's not going to come up in the part of this essay that I'm going to read, but just so you have that context. And the subtitle is A Science Love Letter. Starting in Minnesota darkness, 3 of us drive north. By the time the sun is up, the bare deciduous trees give way to the dark green of conifers. The edge of the lake is a boundary with no meaning. The snow thigh deep, the lake ice 2 feet thick beneath the snow. I place a rope across my chest and pull the loaded sled behind me. Between us, we pull 30 plastic tubes the width of my upper arm, 15 metal rods the width of 2 fingers, measuring tape, sandwiches, chocolate bars, and a roll of duct tape. We go to the middle of the lake, clear snow from the ice, auger a hole, and assemble our equipment. 5 or 6 or 10 hours pass with jokes, periods of silence, and we pull 15,000 years of mud from the lake, the time since ice sheets melted in this region. When I return home from expeditions, I wake in the night thinking I'm in a tent. I free fall in the stillness of my house, the aloneness of the indoors. I spend months in the laboratory uncovering the 1.5 meter sections of mud that I keep wrapped in layers of saran, stored in plastic tubes, sorted on shelves in a walk-in refrigerator. I work through the length of them, sampling mud and extracting the lignin and waxes from fragments of wood and leaves. My hand squeezes the trigger of a spray bottle over and over. I sieve, search for a seed, a piece of cone, something with carbon that I can use to place a sequence of mud in time. A meter of sediment could contain thousands of years or just one catastrophic moment. I'm going to skip to another part of the essay. I take the raw data from running samples of mud through the instruments in the laboratory, the data ordered by depth converted to time. I can't smell the trees or feel the sun, but thousands of years of time flow through my mind, and I see the retreating ice sheets, growing and shrinking lakes, the march of deciduous trees northward. I'm no longer held to my dusty university office, not pinned to the present moment. This is time unobserved. The lover baking bread to send in the mail, hands kneading the dough, yeast brewing and pushing the wet mound up and up. So after I went to work in the Senate in DC, I succeeded in finally coming back to Minnesota where I had done my PhD. And I first worked for the state. I was managing the state's second climate plan. And that on the side of that, I was doing some water policy work. I was doing a lot of public presentations on water policy. And during that time, totally separate from that, Governor Dayton had his epiphany that our water was not clean and that we were not making progress in having clean water, and that there were even parts of the state where there weren't lakes that were safe to swim in. And that was really, just kind of like the power of communication, the power of headlines. There was a single headline that said, there are no swimmable lakes in southwestern Minnesota. And that was the trigger for Dayton, where he just said, we're going to do something. His cabinet was not on board. The House and Senate were not on board. Basically, nobody was on board. And Dayton, he kind of made this plan and he announced it the next day. So there wasn't like a long time. And usually in politics, there's something you want to do and you meet with people and you build coalitions and you make kind of some deals and some compromises and you shape something that a number of people are either going to get behind or they're not going to attack. And this was like not playing by any of those rules. which meant that by the time that I came into Dayton's office to be his water advisor, which was, I don't know, maybe 6 months after the initial announcement of this, it had passed through the legislative process, everybody was angry at us. So the environmental organizations who I would have thought would be our collaborators their feelings were really hurt because they hadn't been included. They're upset Dayton passed the law with, so it's having the requirement is for farmers to have buffers of perennial vegetation between row crop agriculture and public waterways. The initial law that passed was 100-foot buffers. And after that passed, Dayton, in just conversation with legislators, agreed to make it 50 feet instead, which felt like a really big loss to a number of people. But it was, I think, reading the political tea leaves of what seemed possible. So here you can see what it looks like without a buffer, what it looks like to have a buffer. If you drive through Minnesota, you'll see the buffers. We had 98% compliance throughout the state by the time Dayton left office. So that was, I think, really successful and also sort of maybe not successful because people were really mad. But so for that job, I did a lot of public engagement, which is how I came to Ely to do that town hall. And I went to other places to do town halls. And those town halls were very informative to me because I was talking to a lot of angry people who weren't my cabinet members that I had to manage and control. And they weren't legislators who I needed to try to manage and control. They were people. And so it was much more of a just listening. There wasn't something that had to happen other than me just listening from my perspective. And I also went to a lot of people's farms and saw all the different kinds of interesting things they were doing and heard the different ways they were thinking about things. So I thought I'd read one last short section from the book about these town halls, and then maybe we can have some discussion and do something a little bit creative and goofy. So this essay is called The Irrational Logic of Our Bodies on the Landscape. And the Pledge of Allegiance comes up here. I'm not going to read the whole essay, but at the beginning I talk about, so in water meetings, you start by saying the Pledge of Allegiance, which I didn't know. I learned when I was emceeing a summit with 3,000 people, and I got shoved on stage, go lead the pledge. And it was oh my God, do I remember all the words? But thankfully everybody else started saying it, so I remembered the words. But it's an interesting thing. It's symbolic, and I think it's deeply meaningful that water meetings start with the pledge, that this is part of why we make the deal to be governed, to participate in society, is that there are shared goods that we all need, that take all of us as a community to have, and clean water is one of them. So starting kind of near the end of the essay, this is me and Dayton talking. Do you remember the St. Cloud protest? I asked a few months later. The governor wears a flannel shirt and one of his socks has a hole in it. The white tablecloth of his dining room is littered with M&M wrappers and Diet Coke cans. There are homemade cookies on a gold rimmed plate, and the sun streams in a window overlooking the garden with its fountain. I really enjoyed talking to all the people at the town halls, the governor smiles. A strange unease comes over me, and joy is not a word I would use for the town halls. I was counting the minutes, delivering a show, but for him, it was always about the people in any and all forms. That was why he traveled the state. He was focused on making connections, not on achieving tangible outcomes. And just for context, I had a meeting with an environmental group leading up to these town halls, and they said, we really don't like your language. We want language that has a goal of we're going to go on town halls to figure out how many parts per million of these chemicals. And it was well, that's not that's not what we're going to be doing. But just that there was an expectation of not just a tangible outcome like an idea or a regulation, but something as specific as how many parts per million of chemicals we have in our water. I think back to the 10 times I raised my voice to pledge allegiance to our country and the hundreds of voices that joined at each town hall. I didn't stand for the pledge in high school because I felt like the got it reference wasn't mine. But what links my homeroom in Providence, Rhode Island, to the water town halls in rural Minnesota is less about the words or what they mean than it is about the power of voices joining together. We connect with each other when we do the same thing at the same time. At the town halls, an old man talked about farming his family's homestead. A tribal chairman presented on stage and spoke so quietly it forced stillness over the crowd. A group of older people in matching blue pro-mining shirts threatened to cause a disturbance, but then dissolved into discussion tables. A Somali member of a school board in southern Minnesota filled a table with his daughters. All this I hold on to, I treasure. But when the change happened inside me, I was standing outside a bathroom in north central Minnesota with a group of protesters who, just a few moments before, in the main meeting space, had shoved phone cameras in my face and shouted at me. In the hallway, we circled up and spoke of being mothers. One of the protesters had a white plastic mask pushed up on her forehead. This was when we looked each other in the eye. It resolved nothing concrete. We were just a circle of mothers, seeing each other's beating hearts. Perhaps being in relationship with nature starts with relating to each other. From these town halls, I hold on to the truths that go beyond science. Science in our lives is part of larger narratives, and what we believe in are our stories, not science. We live by our stories. So, in the spirit of doing the same thing at the same time and telling stories, I want to invite you guys to be part of the community nature book. So this is a community bookmaking project that I'm taking to everywhere I go on my book tour. And what it has is pages for you to put book plate stickers in. So at each of your seats, there was a postcard of the book and then a book plate sticker. And the invitation is to write a 7-word story about your relationship to nature. And so if you can use this space to write your 7 words, and then ex libris means something along the lines of this book belongs to. And so you put your name in whatever form you want it to be. You can use a pen name. And then if you want to put the book plate into the book, or you can just give it to me and I can put it in the book later, then the book belongs to you. It becomes this shared book that we are all making together. So if you just want to take a couple of minutes to do that. I put one at, oh, not the seats on the side. Yeah, here. If you need pens, raise your hand. We have pens. And if you don't have you need it. Here, I can go hand out. Okay. Yeah. The idea with 7 words is that like it can't be perfect. It can't have a beginning, middle, and end. Don't think about it too much. Just do it. Somebody, oh, we got one. Does anybody else need a pen? Oh, that's all right. Okay. Anyone need? Here. Yeah. Oh, you're all done. Okay. Would anybody here like? Do you need a pen? Okay. Would you like a pen? You can just give it to me, or you can come put it in the book. Would you like? Okay. Oh, okay. Does anybody else need anything? Yes, I would love to give you a pen. You're welcome. Thank you. And anyone's welcome to come look at this book also and see. Yeah, yeah. So while people are thinking about their 7 words, which I don't think too much, you could spend years thinking of 7 words, or you could just write them. Do people have any questions or anything that you want to bring up? Thoughts, comments? Also, you're welcome to share your 7 words.
So anyone have any thoughts?
Thank you.
Walking, seeing, smelling, feeling sunlight, wind in the face, softness.
Sarah?
Trees help me breathe physically and spiritually.
Share it. Oh no, they can ask anything.
Putting these values of water and mother.
Okay, I asked Anna and she said I could also ask questions about the book and the process. So I have two thoughts, two questions. One, I noticed the use of the present tense throughout. And I'm curious about that as like a creative literary choice. And like, did you have to do a lot of maneuvering to go from your notebooks to the essays as they were in their final form? And how did you choose to stay in the present tense?
So for folks who are in like the literary world, writing in the present tense is like really lowbrow. It's considered kind of immature or poor form because you don't have the distance to reflect. There's a quote from Ursula Le Guin that's like something like writing in present tense, and this is also first person, it's like navigating by a flashlight. Whereas if you were in past tense, you could have like, I don't know, the full moon or something so you can see much further. So it was a very conscious decision to write in the present tense. And I wanted the reader to have the experience of what is it like to be in this place and to have that kind of feeling of like things are coming at you. They're a little bit too close. They're a little bit too much like in your face because that's how it feels to be in these spaces. And I wanted to really convey that experience and the urgency of the experience. I also feel like there's a lot of science writing that's very thoughtful and reflective, which is beautiful and I love to read. But sometimes when it's so wise and reflective, it just sort of feels like you're on the outside of it. Whereas writing in the present tense, you can be kind of coming along for the ride and learning with the person. It's not like coming from my wisest voice. It's coming from the like version of me that's making mistakes, which is, I think, a lot more interesting. And just because there is such a trope of wise, smart scientists that are, people will kind of be like, oh, well, they're a scientist, or like, oh, I don't know math. Like it's like math and science are kind of over here and we're outside. And I wanted to create a voice that felt as relatable as possible. So that was the decision with that. And the challenge with it was just people who are like, don't you know you shouldn't write in the present tense, and ignoring them. The journey from like journals and notes that I had taken to the essays is like pretty intensive. I had all this material written. I have these like specific details that I'd written, which was really helpful for being able to render scenes in a pretty specific, vivid way. But the actual shape of an essay had to be around something. Like there's like an organizing question basically to each essay. And sometimes it was kind of a long process of discovery of like, why am I writing about this? Why is this in my mind? Why am I interested? Why does this bother me? What is it I'm trying to get at? And I felt like there were several iterations that were like just the kind of process of creating clay. And then that like actual shaping of the clay into the book came at the very end. So it was kind of it definitely wasn't like notebook to book.
Okay. Did it die? No. Yes, it did. Okay. I have another question.
Yeah.
Which is,
there's a theme, especially towards the end when you're, okay, we'll just have to share. There's a theme or a thread of like you're doing all this environmental policy work and you're doing a lot of listening, and there are people who question whether or not that does anything or if it's place. And so I'm wondering if now that you have had time and space, like what is your take on whether like the value of giving people time to express themselves and the value of listening, and whether or not that's progress towards addressing climate change or any problem at all?
Yeah, so this is it in the book. You know, when I came into Dayton's office, his cabinet was pissed about dealing with this buffer law. The environmentalists were pissed, farmers, everybody's pissed off. And then we're asking everybody to come to meetings and to do meetings. And the state agencies were like, this is way too much work. The environmental organizations, when Dayton announced that we were going to do town halls, they were like, we're going to boycott your town halls. We're sick of like how much time it takes to attend and participate and be part of these. And it was kind of a wild thing of like, I remember being like, when are you going to get a governor again who's going to put this much interest and effort into the environment? So like, why? It was like it's like you only know how to fight, and you have a governor who's trying to do this stuff, and so you're trying to figure out how to fight it instead of like, how do you ride the wave, and how do you like take this where you want to go, or take credit for it if that's like the thing that you're upset about. So it was this interesting pushback of kind of like the people who would be my allies or team were like, we don't want to do public engagement and you're wasting your time, basically. And I felt like in having time to reflect on it now, I think it's like, you know, democracy is slow and it's super inefficient, and it's meant to be that way. It's meant to be really hard to change things and to do things. And I think there's a lot of stability and value. And it's like, do you go at the pace where you bring people along with you, or do you go at the pace of the urgency you feel on the issue? And if you go at the pace of the urgency and you don't bring people along with you, then they don't own it and they're not part of it. And so I think this like long, slow process of public meetings is totally essential. And it's just like, that's what it means to be part of a community. And community isn't meant to be efficient. I loved hearing all the announcements of your events. You know, and if you were going to make it efficient, maybe you would just have one time slot in one place or something. But instead, like, people have different ideas and they're coming up with it. Things come and go. And that's really important. Anybody else have questions or thoughts? I can bring you the microphone.
Ian, you mentioned Franken several times. I'd like to tell my Franken story.
Everyone has one.
He was running for Senate, and they were having political thing in Grand Rapids at the Col. And I saw Troy in there. And so my wife, Pat, and I went over there, and we're sitting there waiting for the speakers. And there's a lady sitting next to me, and I said, you know, I think Franken would be a pretty good senator. And she said, I do too. My husband.
Franken is a really special person for those of you who haven't gotten to meet her. She was often outside events smoking a cigarette, and she always made sure, like when I went to his house for like a Christmas party or whatever, you know, I had these like little kids, I've been pregnant, I had this new baby, and she'd always make sure I had a place to go, like change the baby, feed the baby, make myself at home. And then like years later, my husband ran into her in a parking lot. She was smoking outside where Al was doing an event with Hillary Clinton, and she recognized him, and she was just like so happy to hang out and talk in the parking lot. But she didn't want to be inside the event with like the hundreds of loud people. But she's a really nice person. There's an essay in the book about being lobbied when I worked for Al Franken, and it refers to the like everybody had an Al story that they wanted to tell. So who here has ever gone to DC and met with your senators or representatives? And was it a good experience overall? And does anybody here like call your congressional delegates? Yeah, you can just call them anytime. And you know, the people who answer the phone, if they don't answer the phone, I called the other day, no, I got the voicemail of Tina Smith's office. And then I texted somebody who works for her and was like, why don't you have a real person? And he said, we have 4 people answering the phones, but we can't keep up. But the people who answer those phones are young, and they're usually like right out of college or they're interns in college, but they grow up to be really important people. So don't be afraid of them. They're like young, they're new at this, but also be really polite and respectful and pay attention, because they're gonna, like one of the guys who answered the phone when I was in Al's office, he works for the FBI now. He sent me a picture of himself in his like training gear. You know, there are people who run for office. Stuart Laurie, who is the legislative director for the Farmers Union, he was answering phones for Al when I worked there. So those people are, don't be afraid of them, and like they're worth getting to know.
I will just remind you that copies of the book are for sale, and it is a very exciting literary experience and very educational and very human. And so I encourage you to purchase a copy and to get it signed by Anna, and to check out the Zine Workshop as well as the Ely Climate Group. Thank you so much for being here.